So, did you succeed? Let's now solve these tasks together. And let's of course start with task number 1. In task number 1, we want to create a new array that contains 3 hobbies. So I'll create that array, and we get various ways of doing that with the var keyword and this slightly more longer syntax, or we use the very concise syntax where I create a hobbies variable and we use the colon equal sign operator to then create that array. Now here for task number 1, we need a real array. No slice, but a real array as I highlight here, and therefore we wanna define the length of that array. So the number of items that will be stored in it in advance. We also need to define the value type in advance. That's the case both for dynamic arrays, slices, and real arrays. And here, since I want to store some hobbies, so some text in the end, string sounds like a fitting name. And then you learned we need the square brackets in front of that. And since we'll have 3 hobbies, I'll add a 3 here, and then curly braces like that. Now we can set our different hobbies by accessing the different indexes and setting it like this. Or we set it all in one go and have something like sports, cooking, and reading as hobbies here maybe. And then of course we don't need that line unless we want to overwrite the first element. Now we created that array and we want to output that array, so with help of the format package and the printline function, we can now print hobbies. And that should be task number 1. Now to see it in action, I'll run this module, and for that I actually need to init my module first of all, which I haven't done before, so let me quickly do that with some dummy identifier, and then I can run this module. So now we see sports, cooking, and reading here. This is working. In task number 2, we now want to output more data from that array. The first element standalone, and then the second and third element combined as a new list. So for that here, task number 2 involves some printing. But now I want to access the first element. And you saw the syntax a couple of seconds ago actually. We can access specific elements in an array to read or set them by using square brackets after the variable name that contains the array. And then we use the index of the element that we want to read or write to. Now the index, that's the important thing, starts at 0. So if we want to read the first element, we don't use 1, but we use 0 instead. And this will now output the first element. Now that's not all though, we should also output the second and third element combined, and for that we'll need a slice, because we learned that with a slice we can select a subset of an array and then work with that. So if you want to select the second and third element, then we want to start at the element with index 1, which is the second element, and then select everything up to another index. That index will be excluded though. So if I would write 1:2, we would not select the second and third element, which you might think, since we have the indexes 1 for the second and the index 2 for the third elements. But instead, since that element will be excluded, we would just select the first element. Instead, we need 3 here, so the index of the last element plus 1 to select that last element and include it in that slice. Or we use the shortcut and just type 1:nothing to select everything up until the end of that array. Now here I'll go for the more explicit syntax, but either of the two approaches is fine. And with that, just to quickly check that, if we run this, we now see sports, which is that first element for line 11, and then cooking and reading, which are the last 2 elements, so the second and third element for this line of code here. So that's also working. In task number 3, we should now create a slice, another slice, based on the first element, so based on that first array actually that we have here, that contains the first and second elements instead of the second and third elements which we have here. So in task number 3, I'll add a brand new slice and now also store it in a variable, and I'll name it first hobbies, or main hobbies maybe. Create a brand new variable, and then use my hobbies array and create a new slice. Now to select the first and second elements, I want to start at the index 0 and then select everything up to index 2, since that will select everything up to the element with index 2, which is the third element, which is then excluded, so it will select the first and second element successfully. Alternatively, here we omit the 0 to start at the beginning of that array on which this slice is based, and then just go up to the third element and exclude that element. Either way, we'll select the first and second element, and with that I also show you 2 approaches of making that selection. And then we also want to print that so that we don't get an error, and print main hobbies here. And now if I zoom out a bit so that we have more code on the screen, if I run this code again, we do get sports and cooking here, which indeed are my first 2 elements. So that is also working just as it should. Now, task number 4 wants us to reslice 3 and change it such that we contain the second and last element now, instead of the first and the second element. Now that works because behind the scenes, a slice actually just points at a part of an array, and we can always select more from that array as long as we expand our selection towards the end of the array. Towards the beginning, that's not possible. And as a in-between step, we can actually again print the capacity with the cap function of main hobbies. And what we'll see when I do that, and I run this code, is that that capacity is free even though main hobbies only contains 2 elements. It's free because the array on which it's based actually has 1 extra element after that last element that we select here when we build that slice. And again, as I mentioned, extending the selection towards the end after we already have a slice is always possible. So we can reassign a value to main hobbies. Hence, I'm not creating a new variable here, I'm using an existing one, and I actually reassign based on my existing main hobbies slice, and we want to create a slice that gives us the second and last element. Now we are basing this new slice on the existing slice. The existing slice contains the first and second element, but because we have that link to the behind the scenes array and extending towards the end is always possible, we can also expand this slice to get the last element of the existing array. Now I'm not interested in the first element anymore, and therefore I'll start at index 1 to omit that first element, which was still part of that slice before, because we included the first element here when we originally created that slice. Now I want to go all the way to the end, and you could therefore think that you can just use this shortcut, but that would actually not work. If you save it like this and you then actually print main hobbies like that, if you give this code a try, you'll see that it actually just outputs cooking. So the last element, reading, is not included. The reason for this is that I'm building my new main hobbies slice on the existing slice, and the existing slice does not include the last element here because we only selected up to the last element, so only the first 2 elements. But I mentioned that expanding would be possible, and it is, but if you do expand a slice in the process of reslicing, then you explicitly need to specify the end index. If you leave it open like this, it will use the last value from the existing slice instead. If, on the other hand, I set this to free as we did it here in line 12 as well. Then we explicitly tell Go that we want to go to the underlying array and give us the element prior to index 3, which is this element which has index 2, and include that in the slice. Can be a bit of a gotcha, but this is how we can now extend our selection here. With this, if we now run this code, we got cooking and reading included. So the second and third element with that reslicing approach. Now in task number 5, we now want to leave that array we worked on thus far and instead create a brand new array that has one special trait. It should be dynamic. So we should be able to add new values to it. And therefore, here I'll add my solution for task number 5. And since it's an array that will contain a bunch of course goals, I will name it course goals. That's my variable name. And to create a dynamic array, we need to create a slice right from the start and let Go create the underlying array behind the scenes for us. The syntax for that is very similar to what we had up there. The only difference is that we don't specify a length ahead of time. The syntax we need here is that we still want to store strings because our goals are still pieces of text. And we still need the square brackets, but we don't give this a fixed length. Instead, we leave the square brackets empty and then add our curly braces to either create this as an empty slice at the beginning or to already store a couple of values. And since we should create at least 2 goals here, I'll start by setting 2 goals, which are learn Go and learn all the basics, something like that. These are my course goals. And that's already task number 5. Now we can also print this to see whether that worked, and hence print course goals. Go run this, and we see our course goals here. So that is working. In task number 6, we now want to change that dynamic array, and we want to set the second goal to a different one and also add a brand new third goal. Now let's start by setting that second goal. For this